What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Well, I see John is blushing already as we get to do this introduction to our next podcast. This is America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin. John Kropsic, always here, steadying the ship. But John, I see you're a little thrown off your game because we're going to be talking about something that we've never discussed before, certainly not in this light. And it's something that, well, we've gone to many places looking for the next trend in America, but we've never found ourselves between the sheets looking for the next trend. And I'm not talking about the KKK. We did something on that. I'm talking about the sheets in the bedroom. We've never done this.
No, we usually leave that for Hugh Hefner.
Oh, Hugh Hefner. Well, I'm not certain. I think he liked to be on top, and I don't know that his current situation allows him to continue to be divine and supine. I'm not certain. But I ran across some increasingly provocative material about the fact that young people in America, and I found this really hard to believe at the beginning, and then when I started reading through the material, I understood a little bit better why this might be going on and why young people aren't as busy, John, as we think they are. Now, we, the older set, we imagine that these guys are, well, rabbit-like.
They're young.
Yeah, they're young. Yeah. They've got a lot of hormones going, raging, and all kinds of bodily fluids that are flowing.
Though sometimes communicating with girls is tough, too.
Well, that is part of, I think, what's going on here today, John. I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, we were doing something on our radio program, and it was about the University of Connecticut and what consent really means in terms of a relationship. And needing to have positive consent, not just acquiescent consent. And it was a little confusing to me. Luckily, every relationship I've ever been in is totally consensual, and there haven't been that many, honestly. I'm certainly no Wilt Chamberlain, that I will say, either on or off the basketball court. But with that said, it was one of those things where where's the green light, where's the red light? And I think there is some of that wrapped up in this new phenomenon that we're seeing where American young people are having less sex than we could ever imagine. And this is being studied empirically. People are following this trend, and it's real. And it has a lot of implications for our society. So I think we were imagining that this was going on, but maybe they're just not really agreeing with each other.
Well, there's less getting married. They're not getting married as much. And, so that kind of is a flag right there, I would suppose.
And I think a lot of our guys are a little bit behind, John. I mean, we do some more reporting on this in another podcast, but a lot of the young guys in America are not finding their way as early as perhaps we did. And they're not confident. Maybe they're not even living in a situation where having a relationship is easy in their own apartment. They're still living with mom and dad in the basement, and that can really put the kibosh on things.
Boy, oh boy, you're not kidding.
But mom and dad probably don't hear as well as they used to, so maybe that helps. But nonetheless, there's a lot going on that leads to the fact that there is less sex. And if that leads to less procreation, then we're looking at a situation like Japan, where they really have not replaced themselves and they've been stagnant in terms of their economy. And America is showing signs of that elsewhere, too, I think.
Europe is having a problem with this.
Oh, really?
All through Europe, yeah.
Well, I've read about the Italian boys who like to stay home with mama, and mama feeds them so well. But they still seem to be a pretty randy crowd in Italy, from what we're told. Well, at any rate, maybe it's our cell phones, 24/7 entertainment. Let's figure out what's going on here, because this truly is a trend. It is one of those social trends that we tell people we are not afraid to delve into. And it's kind of interesting. We'll call this one Too Much Netflix, Not Enough Chill, with W. Bradford Wilcox from the American Enterprise Institute.
And he actually investigated this.
He did. He, in fact, went undercover to find out what was going on here. And we're grateful he did here on America Trends. We received a release from the American Enterprise Institute that got our attention here at America Trends, and it was titled Too Much Netflix, Not Enough Chill, Why Young Americans Are Having Less Sex. And with us to discuss this from AEI is Bradford Wilcox. Brad, what's the story here? Young people having less sex?
You know, Larry, it's surprising, I think, 50 years after the sex revolution, but we're actually seeing as younger adults are having sex later, and they're having less of it. And, so the big question that we've been wrestling with, and that's me and my colleague Sam Sturgeon at Demographic Intelligence, is, what's going on here?
And what is it that you're finding? I mean, a lot of us would think that with what we see portrayed in the media, that that's not the case.
Well, first it's important just to get some basic facts out here. We see, for instance, in data from the CDC, that the share of teenagers reporting sex has gone from 47% in 2005 to 41% in 2015, so obviously down. Mm-hmm. And the share of younger adults for ages 18 to 30 who are reporting that they haven't had sex in the preceding year rose from about 12% in the early 2000s to 18% in 2014 through 2016. So again, the bottom line here is that teenagers and younger adults are having sex later, they're having sex less often, and they're more and more both kind of virgins and kind of technical virgins in the mix. And we've got a couple of theories about what we think is driving this. It's important to note here that we really are more in the sort of hypothesis testing stages of our work on this because it's, there's just this new trend, and so we're all kind of wrapping our heads around it. But a couple of things come to mind here. One, of course, is that, many young adults are now living at home in mom's or mom and dad's basement. And, it certainly could be the case that, living in your parents' basement is not conducive to an active, sex life. It's also the case, too, that, this generation has become, more cautious about many things. For instance, they're less likely to be driving. They take longer to get their driver's license. They drink less. And so sex is a risky thing. And so I think that's also part of the story. They're just more cautious about things like sex. But a third idea, I think that's probably the more provocative piece of our article in Politico, which appeared a little bit earlier in Politico, is we think that sort of shifts in technology are also helping to drive this. We think that the rise of smartphones and tablets and screens of, any number of kinds and social media are kind of proving to be kind of digital distractions for younger adults and in ways that inhibit them spending time with friends, with potential romantic partners, and even kind of when they're with someone, in terms of having sex with that person. So that's why we titled this article, Too Much Netflix, Not Enough Chill.
Well, we've all been told that social media is really becoming absorptive of so much time on the part of people of virtually all ages. And so we're really seeing this, that perhaps they don't have as many things that, they want to do because they have so much entertainment available to them literally at their fingertips and not in the way that we might think with sex. So that really, you think, is a driving factor?
It certainly, we think, is an important theory to keep testing. And the trend lines just kind of match what's happening so nicely. And, of course, it could be something that we're missing. But if you look at the sort of increasing adoption of smartphones and of social media, you see that's clearly correlated, at least for teenagers, to less time spent socializing in person, to less dating, and to less sex. This is work done by Gene Twenge. It's kind of looking at these trends for teens. And so we think that, as we look at the data, that probably the same kinds of, things are unfolding for many young adults as well. And again, I would say probably in about, 5 years we'll have even better data looking at this sort of on a longitudinal basis. But we think that at least the initial evidence is very suggestive in this regard.
Okay. I'm not certain that your data even incorporates some of the concerns that have been evidenced by the Me Too movement and the fact that this might have an impact on the sexuality of young men and young women.
Well, when it comes to the Me Too movement, our sense is the Me Too movement will accentuate this kind of retreat from sex. It will make young adults even more, we think, careful, more cautious about sex than they were even before, the Me Too movement took hold. And so that will mean probably even less sex for young adults down the road. Now, there are two ways I think this is probably a good thing. One is that we know that, of course, non-consensual, but even casual sex often isn't very good sort of socially and psychologically for younger adults, particularly for women. So I think that's probably a good thing. The second point that I make is that we've actually seen a decline in recent years in non-marital childbearing, in the rate of non-marital childbearing. And so this, I think, the Me Too movement will also kind of accentuate that, which we think also is a good thing. But there are two ways in which we're concerned about this. One is that we think it will drive down U.S. fertility even more. And right now we're headed towards record lows in the American fertility rate. So that gives us cause for concern. And then secondly, we just worry that, it might make some young adults, some young men especially, really kind of overly cautious, overly fearful when it comes to asking a woman out or expressing interest in her for fear of kind of creating an uncomfortable situation. And, for many of us, I think relationships at that initial stage can be a little bit awkward. And if that awkwardness is sort of increased dramatically, that might put an unnecessary damper on romantic relationships in America.
And you say that even today, before this movement has really taken hold, that dating has gone down precipitously in recent years. Is that attributable, again, to the smartphone and all the entertainment available, that they're just not going out as much?
Yeah, I think that's part of the story. Again, that data is for teenagers, but there's been a precipitous decline in dating that parallels kind of the rise of smartphones and social media, ironically. And there's also been, for adults, we've seen a decline in socializing that, certainly runs hand in hand with the rise of smartphones. Now, I think critics of this thesis, of the sort of technology, electronics thesis, would say, well, isn't this maybe some kind of product of the recession, the follow of the Great Recession? And that certainly could be part and parcel of this, but, the economy's been improving in recent years, and a lot of these sort of social and psychological indicators that Gene Twenge has been monitoring, have been headed in a bad direction. Again, as sort of smartphone penetration has increased, and even as the economy has kind of rebounded. So we don't think this is really driven by economics.
When we look at some of the upsides and downsides of some of these trends about sex and dating, one of the downsides would be if a lot of young guys in particular are moving their interest away from real physical contact that is meaningful and into pornography. And this is likely a factor too.
No, exactly. There's, I think, part and parcel of what's happening here is that kind of like electronic alternatives to real sex have become more and more varied and exciting in some ways. And, I think with the rise of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and everything else, sort of the electronic alternatives to real sex are going to become, that much more available. But, my intuition here is that, there's something about being in a real relationship with a real person that's much better for us, generally speaking, spending a lot of time with Pornhub or with, down the road, some kind of sex bot.
When we look at the impacts of all of this, many of us might think about Japan and the fact that they are aging so rapidly. And the United States, of course, is now with a much lower birth rate. And some of these trends, dating later and less often, less sex, might suggest that we are going to see a diminution in our birth rate, and we may not be bringing in as many immigrants. Play this out for us.
We're concerned as we kind of look around the world and, focus in particular on what's happened in Japan. And what you see in Japan is that sex, relationships, and marriage have fallen precipitously among younger adults in recent decades. And yet, of course, they have access to thriving online and entertainment sectors, from anime to their own social network, Lin, I think it's called. And what we see in Japan is that a lot of young adults are not in relationships. They're not getting married. They're not having sex. In fact, a staggering share of young adults in Japan, ages 18 to 34, report that they are virgins. Fully 1/3 of Japanese young adults between the ages of 18 and 34 report they haven't had sex. And as we kind of have looked at sort of accounts from Japan, we see, for instance, that this whole category of what are called herbivores. These are men who've got little or no interest in sex in Japan, and report often that, they feel uncomfortable or they have no confidence or uninterested in women and in sex. And of course, as that plays out, down the life course, what you see is, of course, not just less marriage, but less kids. And as the people enter into their older years, there are millions of older Japanese people who are living by themselves, often in apartments or homes, often with very little contact from relatives, and very lonely. So the New York Times ran a big story a few months ago talking about how, quote, a generation of elderly Japanese is dying alone in extreme isolation, unquote. And they kind of recounted how a lot of these people, all these older Japanese folks, they would die and no one would notice for weeks that they had died. It just was just kind of mind-blowing, but it's a sort of a powerful and provocative portrait of what happens, when these fundamental forms of human communication, human interaction, and human family life break down.
Well, we see a lot of our very bright young people, the millennials, moving into cities and liking the pace of the city, liking the fact that they've got these all-consuming professions, and they are getting married later if they're getting married at all. So do you see what happened in Japan portending what's going to be happening perhaps in the United States?
Yeah, that's the concern. We haven't by any means gotten down the road, towards Japan. The concern is that we could be beginning to step, down the kind of road that Japan has taken. So our fertility rate's at about 1.77 right now, as compared to Japan's, which is about 1.4. It has been that way for, for a long, long time. That's just one sort of way of kind of giving you. And what that means basically is that right now the average American woman will have about 1.7 kids over her lifetime, compared to the average Japanese woman who's had slightly more than one child over her lifetime on average.
But is that considered to be a replacement rate or less than?
No, it's not. The replacement rate is 2.1, and so we're well below that now in the U.S., and we're headed, even farther down in the next couple of years. So again, the question is, whether or not we're going to keep going down this road, or if there'll be some kind of course correction. And it's too early to tell, obviously, what the future holds. But again, if we don't see a course correction, then we would be worried about how this plays out for sex, for marriage, for family formation.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. And let's play it out just a little bit, and then we'll let you go. But we're talking about fewer workers, fewer consumers, fewer people to help pay for some of the obligations to the older generation of baby boomers. It has many impacts.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about fertility, but when you have a sustained pattern of low fertility, as you've had now in much of East Asia and much of Southern Europe in the last few decades, what that means is that your workforce begins to shrink, and the relative share of people who are retired and requiring some kind of pension, or in our case, Social Security, is comparatively high compared to the number of workers who can support them, which puts a real strain on the public purse and on the economy. And then you also see, oftentimes, towns, rural areas kind of emptying out, and schools getting shuttered, kids, lacking in siblings, sort of caregiving for individual adult children becoming much more burdensome because they can't share the care of their parents, for instance, with one or two siblings. It's all on them when mom and dad are getting older and infirm. So I think the point simply is that if you see kind of a massive decline in fertility, that can have a lot of negative impacts that we're not accustomed to thinking about here in the U.S.
Absolutely. So we started and we were a little bit cheeky at the beginning, but it is a serious issue, and I know that there are a lot of millennials who like to listen to us and podcasts, so I would encourage them to do that and now get busy. Is there a sexual counter-revolution going on in America? I want to thank Brad Wilcox for being with us from the American Enterprise Institute today on America Trend.
Good to be here.